Okay, so welcome to our first lecture in biological psychology. This is an introduction to behavioral neuroscience and the biological foundations of behavior. I'm Dr. Bo Sortman. I am a behavioral neuroscientist. I got my PhD in technically pharmaceutical sciences, but what I did in grad school was study rat cocaine self-administration. And what I do now as a postdoctoral researcher here at the University of Buffalo is I study fluid homeostasis and thirst behaviors. So when I went back to school, I think that I wanted to be a therapist initially. I was interested in human behavior and I wanted to know why we do what we do. And honestly, that kind of led to kind of a really deep philosophical endeavor trying to figure out what am I? And what are you? If we're trying to understand our behavior, if we're trying to understand our psychology, if we're trying to understand why we do what we do, we have to know what drives us. We have to know what we are, what we're composed of. And of course, there are all the physical things that we are. We're our skeletal system, or our skeletal structure rather, where our body parts, our eyes and our hands and our feet. We are emotional things. We are imagination. We are entities that can produce something kind of horrifying like this. Or we are also, bundles of joy. We are happy things at times. We're emotional. We are physical. We're all sorts of things, And, you can describe me in many ways. If an alien were to come here and they say, Bo, what are you? I say, well, I'm a scientist. That would be true. I'm a brother. That's also true. I'm a romantic partner. I'm a teacher. I'm a person. I'm conscious. I'm aware. Now, some of these things are a little bit more kind of clear. A scientist is somebody that's professionally using the scientific method to ask questions about the world. I think that that's kind of what a scientist is. I'm a brother, so definitionally speaking, I have a sibling. I'm a romantic partner, which means that I have somebody that I have a significant other or whatever you might say. Like these kind of are definitionally, I'm a teacher. I'm producing this lecture right now for you to learn. So I guess that means that I'm a teacher. I'm a person. Again, these are all kind of definitionally true. Whatever a person is, I'm actually not completely sure what that means really a person, because that actually is a little bit more complicated than I thought when I initially wrote that. But I am conscious. That's also pretty complicated. We're not going to get too much into the philosophy of consciousness and things like that, but we do need to think about these things from a philosophical perspective, because it is kind of a lot more complicated than we might think on its face. I am aware. That's kind of like a subcategory of consciousness, I think. I think that in order for you to be conscious, you may need to be aware. Why do I do what I do? That's kind of what really, again, led me in this direction. I had if you were to tell me in 2025 when I went back to school, or in 2015 when I went back to school, if you were to say, 10 years from now, your job is going to be studying thirst in rats and looking at what happens to their brains, I would say that's kind of ridiculous. But it makes sense why this is the path that I've gone down, is because why I went into psychology originally was because I wanted to know why, honestly, the people in my personal life did what they did. Why I seemed so kind of, in my earlier life, like so unable to change behaviors that I wanted to change. Am I free? If you're going to go down the thoughts of consciousness and the mind and psychology, you're going to start asking these kind of questions. If psychology is a science and in not a philosophical discipline, I think that kind of what that means is that we can derive truths about the natural universe in regards to a psychological truth. If there are psychological truths, and if it is the case that people, individuals, animals, whatever we are, kind of has a mathematical equation with an output, then this becomes a lot scarier, this question, because I think that generally speaking, when we talk about freedom and free will, we have an idea that, we have the ability to make decisions and we use that that freedom to do it. So what does free will even mean? Yeah, I mean, I don't even know. I think that we have, again, a colloquial understanding of free will, but it's almost like we feel like we think of it as like a superpower. Like you have the ability just to do whatever you want to do. If you want to go be a scientist or a philosopher or a astronaut, then you can just go decide to do that. Obviously, there has to be some prerequisites that will allow you to do that kind of thing. If you're going to be an astronaut, do you have the physical ability to withstand, that kind of training? And if you don't have the physical ability, maybe you have some kind of physical disability that makes it so you just don't, like, I don't know what you need to be an astronaut, or maybe Navy SEAL. Let's say that you're going to be a Navy SEAL, but you don't have arms or legs or something. I'm not sure. And that disqualifies you because you can't do the basic physical training that's required or whatever. Does that mean that you don't have free will? Is free will supposed to be two words? I don't even know. Is that one word? I think I may have made a mistake there. In any case, what does any of this have to do with biological psychology? Yeah, I haven't looked at. I produced this lecture and then I go back to it later. So, what does any of this have to do with biological psychology? Well, I think we have to first define what is psychology. And I think that psychology is the study of behavior. We have also certain aspects of psychology that may be like the study of mind. I think I might get into that a little bit later. So let's first just figure this out. So psychology is, looking at Levi jumping through this wall and asking the question, why is he doing this? How is he doing this? What makes it possible for him to do this? Looking at this horse jumping over these hurdles and looking at these rats run away. So there's the physiology that is always going to be essential to psychology, and that's because physiology is necessary for behavior. So I think that psychology, what does that have to do with biological psychology? Well, first we need to understand what psychology is, and it's the study of behavior. Just full stop. That's what psychology is to me. I'm a behavioral neuroscientist, so I have this kind of bias. But if you look at social psychology, clinical psychology, any of these things are kind of looking at people or other animals and their behavioral outputs. So, behavior, that could also get kind of complicated, but let's see how the APA defines it. It's an organism's activities in response to external or internal stimuli, including objectively observable activities, introspectively observable activities, and non-conscious processes. So that's really important to psychology, because if you first say behavior, you may think, okay, well, behavior is just these acts of physical outputs that we can observe, right? But not necessarily. I mean, behavior is also internal states, as we can see here. Observable activities, yes, but introspectively observable activities also. So why am I afraid? Why do I feel anxiety right now? And also non-conscious processes like breathing is a behavioral output that we might not think of as behavior because we don't have control over the breathing. I mean, we can take control and take a breath, but we have this non-conscious process that makes us breathe, right? Let's see what the second one is. More restrictively, any action or function that can be objectively observed or measured in response to controlled stimuli. So behavior is contracted objective behavior with mental activities which were considered subjective and thus unsuitable for scientific study. So that is something that we'll get into a little bit in greater detail when we go over like the learning aspect, the learning portion that we have later on in the semester. But in brief, there was, the behaviorist revolution, which was driven by B.F. Skinner. You should have gotten some of this information maybe from your Psych 101 course. But basically, B.F. Skinner and the behaviorists said, well, there may be a reason why the rats are running away from the light in this picture, right? And that's an internal activity that we can't measure. What we can measure, though, is that the fact that the rats are running away and the distance in which they're running, etc. So just so you're aware, there are these two definitions are both important. And it just kind of depends on the context. I mean, if you're interested in only stuff that you can measure objectively, then that's going to be the second definition. But realistically, if we're talking about behavior, we may be talking about internal things that we can't measure. And I think that's what a lot of people try to do when it comes to psychology. Certainly, that's what I was trying to do when I first went back to school. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that might be. So we have Eren Yeager here. I'm a big fan of anime and Attack on Titan, but there's a process that Eren takes internally, going from this kid watching the scout regiment come back all destroyed and murdered and stuff, his rage that he feels towards the Titans, towards his society, towards the unfair nature of the world that he finds himself in. And then, of course, his ultimate plan and the way that he becomes kind of a psychopath, you know what I mean, in the end here. But there's a transformation occurring in his like mental space that is unobservable, that would also be part of behavior. And also, it's his mind that's changing. Psychology is also the study of the mind. And that's really important, because then we got to ask the question, like, what is the mind? I mean, so let's go ahead again. This is going to be from APA, I believe is where I got this from. But broadly, all intellectual and psychological phenomenon of an organism encompassing motivational, affective, behavioral, perceptual, cognitive systems. That is the organized totality of an organism's mental and psychic processes and the structure and functional cognitive components on which they depend. Let's see what the rest of it says. The term, however, is also used more narrowly to denote only cognitive activities and functions such as perceiving, attending, thinking, problem solving, language, learning, and memory. The nature of the relationship between the mind and the body, including the brain and its mechanisms or activities, has been and continues to be the subject of much debate. And it talks about the mind-body problem and the philosophy of mind. So when we're talking about the mind, in this course, I'm a neuroscientist. I have a proclivity to think that the mind just is the body, because it seems to me that without the brain, you don't have the mind, right? So we need to really make it clear that there's a difference between the concept of the mind, which is literally this entire, I mean, it's complicated. It's this definition that we are talking about. What are you? You are your mind in a lot of ways. What your history, your personality, everything like that. You are your mind, right? That's not the same as your brain, though. Let's see. Are you a mind? What are you? Yeah. So, what are you? So you have your mind, which is what you are, I think. And that's what I'm saying here. Are you a mind? I think we are minds. But then, or are you a body? So are you, are you your finger? I mean, it seems like we're not our finger, right? So we go to dualism and monism next. So it seems like we probably aren't our finger, because if we lose our finger, we don't lose ourselves, but we do lose a part of ourselves, right? And depending on how catastrophic an injury is, you may actually lose a lot of who you are. If you lose your legs, if you lose your arms, if you lose your stomach, you know what I mean? There's people that have all sorts of medical conditions that really change them. Not just physically, but because of that physical change, it changes their personality as well. So I think that's really an important thing to consider, this dichotomy between the mind and the body. A lot of people see themselves as some entity that's like looking out of their eyes. You know what I mean? It's like whatever it is that you're somewhere behind your face, right? That's kind of how a lot of people tend to think about this. But I mean, is that true? I mean, what's behind there? I mean, what's behind your face is just organs and a nervous system leading to the brain. Like, are you your brain? Okay, so let's get into dualism and monism, or monism, however you say this. This is Descartes, and let me go ahead and move my face. Anyway, So this is Ramon Descartes, and Cartesian dualism is what people normally are talking about when they're talking about dualism. So dualism is the idea that there is a supernatural and a natural environment, and your body is being controlled by your soul or your mind. And your body would be the natural aspect of what you are, your organs and your systems and everything. And basically your soul or your mind, whatever it is actually what's controlling this vessel that is your body. So that's one way to think of it, and I think that that's what people, a lot of times, even if they are atheist or agnostic, they will kind of think of their body as a robot that they pilot. And that they have like a soul or a mind, and that is what is actually who they are or what they are. So that's kind of this important thing, is that dualism is the idea that there's kind of two things here: a supernatural soul or mind, and then there's the natural body. And your body isn't really what you are. So at the end of each of these, I'm gonna have like little I'm gonna have like a little I'm gonna have a little slide kind of saying what you should know for the exam, but I'll also try to remember saying things like during the lectures, that this is one of those things. Like, you need to understand what dualism and monism is. Dualism is the idea that there are two separate entities, a supernatural and a natural. Your natural is your body, and the supernatural aspect is your soul or your mind, and it controls your body. But if that were true, then it seems a little bit weird how you can mess with somebody's behavior and personality just by messing with their body. Okay, so this is Phineas Gage, and certainly if you took a intro to psych, then you have seen Phineas Gage, and he's holding here a spike, a railroad spike, and his eye is closed because his eye is gone. So what happened to him is he was a railroad worker and had a terrible accident. Somehow, he's hitting these spikes that are driving the railroad into the ground, the rails itself, and it shot back up. I don't know if they used dynamite or what the heck they're using back in the day, but basically this spike shot back up and went through his eye and ripped out a part of his cortex. And essentially what happened to Phineas Gage was that his personality changed drastically after this accident. And so this is kind of essentially how behavioral neuroscience works, is that there is these observations that, people have damage to certain parts of the brain, and that changes their behavior. In this case, the behavior that changed was both internal states, like his emotional state, and external measurable things, like the fact that he, his behavior completely changed. I mean, the fact that he was a real well-mannered person before, and he became a jerk and used a lot of profanity, all sorts of things like this. So, this is Phineas Gage. You definitely need to know about Phineas Gage. And the question here is that if dualism is true, and it is the case that there are two things, there's the mind and the body, and those are separate, the mind being supernatural and the body being natural. Also, by the way, supernatural just meaning above the natural, a distinct thing from the natural universe. If that were true, then why does it seem like your personality and what would be your soul or your mind, the essence of you, why is so much of that dependent upon your brain? Because certainly your brain is an organ, your brain is natural. If you are your brain, then it can't just be so simple to say as, that there's this dualistic thing. It's just like, if you are your brain, you just are. It just, monism is just true, right? Now, this is something, my cat's going to cause issues. Okay. So this is something I don't want to now. As obviously a behavioral neuroscientist, um, I'm going to have a proclivity to think that monism is true, but for people that are watching this that are going to be a little bit more philosophically inclined, just know that the mind body problem is not something that is just solved and true. There's a philosophical issue, and you should really look into the philosophy of mind or take some philosophy courses because, scientific findings and empirical findings are not the same thing as philosophical understanding of reality, right? So just know that, like, while scientists and myself included is going to take a stance that monism is probably the case, there are a lot of really good arguments for dualism, even though monism seems so convincing to me. So you may want to look further into that, especially if you're religiously inclined. Then monism just is almost certainly not going to be the case. So in any case, let's go ahead and look at the difference between dualism and monism. So dualism posits that the mind is a separate entity from the body. Okay, so that's essentially what dualism is that you have, and I know I've said this like 15 times, but I'm saying this because some people may not, listen fully the entire time. So dualism is the idea that the mind is a supernatural thing. It's separate from your body. It may or may not have implications in a religious context. I think that it has some pretty important religious context. As somebody that was raised in a very religious place, I think that it does have some implications. If monism is true, then I don't see how I could have. I don't see how you can keep your religiosity. But importantly, it suggests that you are not a body. You are a mind or a soul, and you have a body, okay? So that is the main crux of dualistic thinking, is that you're not your body, you are your mind or you are your soul, and whatever those things are. I say soul here because if you're religious, then you may have the concept of soul. You could be a dualist and not be religious, though. You know what I mean? So you could be a dualist and be agnostic, and think of the mind as a supernatural thing that controls the body. Monism, on the other hand, posits that the mind is an emergent property of the brain. Okay, and obviously, as a scientist, as a behavioral neuroscientist, this is going to be the stance that I would take. And it suggests that you do not have a body, but rather you are your body, your brain, your biology. So if you're coming from a scientific, physical, naturalistic perspective, you're probably going to be a monist. That would say that actually you literally are your body. You're your finger, you're your fingernail, all that is part of you. And everything that is physical about you is what is producing your mind. So you definitely need to know the difference between dualism and monism. So what is some evidence for monism? Obviously, again, as a physicalist, as a naturalist, as a behavioral neuroscientist, I'm going to be taking the stance of monism. So this is why I was convinced by this, is that when you are not conscious, your experience does not seem to exist. It seems like when I'm asleep and not having a dream, I'm not there anymore. It seems like when somebody is in a coma, we can't know what their experience is like, but it just seems like sometimes people go into comas and then when they wake up, they have no recollection of that coma, meaning that it could be a learning or a memory issue. Maybe you can't encode memory. Maybe you are conscious, but you just don't remember it. But it seems like if you're not conscious, your experience does not exist, right? And that's kind of like tautology. It seems like experience and consciousness kind of are the same thing. You don't have control over your internal or emotional states to experiences. So you can control your behavior to a certain extent, but if somebody cuts you off on the freeway, obviously you don't have to chase them down and beat them up. You have some control over that, But the fact that you are filled with rage, agitation, and everything like that is kind of like this idea that you don't really have that control. I mean, like how angry you get, or if you have the emotional wavelength of a toaster, I mean, that's going to kind of depend on a lot of things that are out of your control. And they all seem to be physical things. You know what I mean? Like how you were raised, and also like kind of how your interpretation of events throughout your life affect you. Because things, people seem to have some kind of predisposition, but you don't have control over that. If you had a soul, or if your mind was piloting your body, it seems like you'd be able to control what you are. But we kind of just are what we are, if that makes any sense. Your emotional states and internal experiences can change depending on physical changes in your brain. That's the thing, is that, let's see where I go next. Oh, yeah. So, this is kind of really convincing to me. Like with Phineas Gage, if you accrue brain damage, what you are and who you are seems to change over time. I mean, you have people that die by suicide after having repeated concussions on their bike. Like, I think his name was Dave Muir, that professional BMX rider who died by suicide. Or Chester from Linkin Park. I mean, there are people that have, I don't know, actually, I shouldn't have said that. I don't know if Chester had brain damage or something like that. I know that he abused drugs a lot in his youth and stuff, but regardless of the point is that people's personalities change after repeated trauma to the brain. And if it were the case that your consciousness and your mind was simply, or rather, if your behavior and your body was just being piloted, then why would damage to your brain cause this kind of thing? Now, we could say that your brain is like an antenna and it's picking up the wavelength or whatever, and like without that thing being properly constructed, then, you're not going to come in properly. But I don't know, it seemed a little bit weird to me. Like if you're going to posit the idea of a soul, doesn't seem like a supernatural thing would require a natural connection to be pristine, but whatever. All conscious experiences are dependent on the interface between your body and the world. That's another thing that's really kind of wild to me, is that like your nervous system, and what we're going to get into a lot later in the, perception, vision, hearing. So there's like your sense organs and their interaction with the nervous system is what allows you to interface between your body and the physical thing that is the world. I mean, you hearing my voice right now is dependent on you having, the being able to perceive the, what's it called? The disturbances in the air are going to vibrate little bones in your ears that are going to activate nerves that are then going to send signals to your brain that are then going to give you the perceptual event of hearing this word and the word I said before it. Your ability to look at the screen and see, my little red dot right here, or the fact that I wrote evidence for monism up at the top, is dependent upon the light bouncing off of the screen and activating cells in your eye that again is going to activate nerves that's going to communicate with your brain, that's then going to cause a perceptual event. So all conscious experiences are dependent on your body. And then, for the final point, animals in general can be forced to behave just by manipulating cells in the brain. So this is also almost certainly true with humans. But with non-human animals, we can demonstrate this in the lab. So here is a video of a mouse that is not hungry, and you can see that it's now eating. So this is a pretty common type of experiment in behavioral neuroscience, But essentially what you see here is that if you're looking, I can't get my cursor there, but if you're looking at the mouse's head, you see a little pink kind of hat that the mouse is wearing, and you see a blue light. And this is called optogenetics. And what's happening here is that the researchers have injected a virus, or they're using a transgenic mouse that expresses a photosensitive protein in an area of the brain that makes you hungry. And what's happening here is that the mouse is already fully fed, but when they're activating this area of the brain, the mouse immediately starts to feel internal cues that it wants to eat, so it begins to eat. When the blue light is off, like it is now, you can see that the mouse is not hungry. It doesn't want to eat. The blue light turns on, and what does the mouse do? Immediately grabs whatever the closest crumb is and starts eating it. Let's see if they turn the laser off again. It's absolutely wild that you have this level of control over this mouse's behavior here. So they're stimulating this area of the brain, and the mouse is eating, and they turn off the laser, and the mouse immediately is like, why was I even eating? I'm not hungry, right? Whatever the mouse is thinking, I have no idea. So in case anyone's interested, this is the BNST to the LH. So that's the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis to the lateral hypothalamus. And we will, when we get to later sections, be talking especially about the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is really important for all sorts of homeostatic regulators, like your hunger and your temperature and things like this. So in any case, I think that's the last. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard for me to understand what it would mean for a dualist perspective when we have such control over the biology. We just get control over the behavioral output. And this is also likely true with people. I mean, the reason why you act is because of how you feel, realistically. Now, that doesn't mean that like you have to run away when you're afraid, but if it is the case that you don't run away when you're afraid, maybe that's because you have this mindset that you will not be intimidated, and that you will, keep in mind what your goal is. But why do you care about what your goal is? Why do you have enough resolve to ignore the instinct of running away in result to that fear, right? So it seems to me pretty convincing that our biology is just controlling our psychology. It seems to me that psychology, or the mind, our psychology, not the science of psychology, but if we're talking about our psychology or your psychology, your mind, whatever that is, it seems to be like it's an emergent property of the brain. And the brain is just a physical part of your body. So that's my introduction to behavioral neuroscience, to biological psychology. That's what we're going to be trying to explain as we go further throughout the course. Some things that will likely appear on the exam. What is psychology? It's the study of behavior. What is the mind? What is the brain? What is dualism? What is monism? Who is Phineas Gage? This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the kind of things that you'll need to know for the exam. And also, just in case I didn't mention it in the syllabus video, my goal is never to trick you. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to try and trick you on exams. So what you need to know in order to pass a lot of these exams are the concepts. And that's why I'm talking at them in such great length, is because like you're not going to be able to pass the exams or take anything away that's important about this class if all you do is just memorize the PowerPoint slides. You need to be able to understand the concepts. What do I mean by dualism? What does it mean for the mind and the brain to be separate entities? right? So yeah, I guess we'll go into our next lecture, which will start to get into some more heavy scientific concepts. This was largely a philosophical lecture, and there will be philosophy throughout, because that's kind of, psychology and philosophy are just really close disciplines. But as we get into some of the more physiological aspects, as we will in the next video, just be aware that things are going to become a lot more fact heavy, if that makes sense. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. I hope that this was informative, and we'll see you in the next video.